through that, because I think some people out there who are probably working through it probably were just like, I don't know where this file is. I think you're missing a file, yet it seems to run okay.
Yeah,
you know, and you're like, oh, it's mystery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that definitely the socket.io URL here. It's like magic. I like it.
So we've covered some, listening and handling messages. We've shown how to kind of send those messages. Again, like we have stuff running locally, so it's going to work. I'd have to come over and go on one browser while you go on the other. Like, don't look at mine. But again, if you had that URL where you could expose it publicly to me, I could be in a browser, working on, having a chat of some sort with you, and all that stuff is going to the local DB. So if you're thinking about deploying it, there's a couple steps that you got to think about in those senses, like, okay, your URI to your DB, like, where is that? Because you're going to want to change that potentially, maybe not, depends on how you deploy, right? You got to think about, your minified files. You got to think about, a couple of those other things that, what port you're running on and things like that when you go and you kind of put it out there. But when you're working on the stuff locally, you can kind of see how you can set up your environment and just get up and running fairly quick. The next step, obviously, if you're doing something that's multi-user, got that kind of communication, is that you're going to have to, throw it out somewhere where people can actually access it so you can test it properly, because two-browser trick is what we all do. But I mean, that's...
Yeah, we want to put it somewhere.
You want to verify.
That's publicly available so that you can see you can test things with other folks as well.
Yeah.
Then there's different solutions to do that. So if you wanted to just expose the local host that you have, there are some tools to do that as well.
Sure.
But it's just a little bit more complicated. I like to just deploy things because it really gets me to simulate an actual deployment.
Yep.
So I like having a staging environment. So I code on my dev machine, I do my dev testing here, then I stage something to the cloud, test it again, and before I actually move it to production.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a pretty popular workflow in the same way. I'm local to get stuff up and running and to test or to experiment, and then as soon as I know that something's kind of good and I've got like an environment that's set, I try to replicate that environment in a production or in staging server, and then move from there, so to speak. So I think we've covered socket.io.
Yep.
We've covered kind of hooking in that back end to that front end. Again, we could easily go and check to make sure those messages in Mongo are being saved. We could go to the DB. And see that they're being saved. But we've integrated all that stuff, so we've got a working application, for all intents and purposes. But now, what do we do with it?
Yeah.
That is just sitting on our machines. It's kind of isolated. So
yeah. So and that's what the next module we'll be talking about. We'll be showing you how you can deploy to Azure in different ways, so that you can deploy your chat room to the cloud. Now, if you don't share the chat room URL, you might even be able to keep it a private chat room.
Yeah.
You got to obfuscate it though a little bit. You got to make sure the URL has like some complex number scheme or something.
Yeah.
You share that URL with your friends, then you've got a private chat room. But for the most part, if someone discovers that one, we haven't added authentication. We haven't added private rooms. That's up to you guys to do that. But we will show you how to get it up on the cloud.
And there's other things like just that, like once again, that database URI that you need. I mean, we set stuff in a path variable. So like when you deploy it, how do you do that? Like how do you set environment variables and things like that? And also, it's one of those things when you're working with source control, depending on how you're working, if you're working, especially with something like GitHub, you don't want those values in your project, especially if it's an open repository. I don't want to see like what, depending on what the value is.
But you don't want to show those private keys, right? Like sometimes, like the Mongo URI, you can put in the password and the username that you need to connect on.
Yeah.
Now, you don't want to have that in your source control at all, actually.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why we use the environment variables, because we don't want to share that private, sensitive information that have anyone be able to connect to our database.
Right, and so that's like one of those things where you go to source control of GitHub and stuff like that, and you'll see in the README, you need to replace this and you need to replace this. You can find it here, here, here. But we'll walk through a little bit, and the next thing is just like, and this is very common when you're deploying, I think, database, any kind of keys, so like API keys, for example, you don't want that in your source control. You might be deploying from source control, you might not. So if it's public, we're going to kind of walk through just setting that up on the server. give you a little preview of Azure and just like all the things that are available to you when you're debugging and deploying, because we know a little bit how to debug a little bit locally. We've seen a couple things that we've done. We'll go through a little bit more detail. But when you put that up into the cloud, how do you start debugging? And so we're going to focus on that kind of stuff in the next module. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back and we'll handle debugging, deploying. I said debugging, like we have a pug around here. Yeah, exactly. You hear that?
He's right down there.
We're going to debug and then deploy and talk a little bit about that and the tools that are available for you to do those kind of things very, very easily from Visual Studio. So 10-minute break. Hope you stick around, and we'll see you shortly. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
It's the last module. I feel like it should be like that. Thank you so much for staying with us while we go through the very basics of deploying a Node application or creating a Node application. Using Mongo, using Jade, Express, all those great things. And now we're towards the very end, the last module of the day. I'm going to start just like doing that with my words where they all kind of run together. Last module of the day. And we're going to start talking a little bit more about Azure, how it works, how you can deploy stuff, how you can take any of these kind of things that you're working on, whether it be Node or variety of other open source projects, and get them up on Azure, how you can debug them.
Yeah.
Which is a big thing, right? Because sometimes your environment's not exactly the same. You don't, you kind of put it out there and you hope it's going to work, and then you're just like, I don't know what's going on here. So you need to be able to debug, and it's really important. So we're going to kind of cover over some of those things. And so this module is all going to be about deploying and debugging. A couple of things that we're going to cover. We're going to look at Azure Websites Overview. We're going to really just go into the dashboard and give you a sense of some of the things that are available, where you find things. This is really handy if you haven't used a lot of Azure, because we can kind of quickly point out all of those prime things you might want to know. And then you can kind of explore after if you want to learn about some of the other great things. We're going to talk about deploying to Azure with Visual Studio, deploying to Azure with GitHub. We'll show an example of that already kind of going. And then debugging remote Node applications with Visual Studio. So how do you debug something when it's already up and kind of in production? Mm-hmm. And oh no, what do I do? How do I fix this? Because that's usually what happens, right? You get an email or something, it's broken. How do I fix this? So that's what we're going to work on. So if we just kind of dig into Azure Websites Overview, you can easily deploy a bunch of different kind of technologies using Azure Websites. And the Azure Websites, if you haven't, gone over and you don't have a login for Azure, you can get, a free trial. I think it's 90 days. You get a variety of things that you can do with it. If you're already listed in maybe your startup and you're listed in BizSpark, you also get Azure credits that way. So you can start, playing with Azure if you haven't already. And there's a bunch of different things. We're going to focus on deploying, obviously, what we built. Also, just kind of showing you a little bit of the dashboard and Azure Websites. So for Azure Websites, you can deploy a bunch of different kind of websites. We're going to show you Node, but you can do Python. It can be PHP, ASP.NET. There are a bunch of different things. There's lots of stuff that you can install just right out of the box. And so, if you want to use something like WordPress, WordPress, one of the top, I would say, PHP projects of all time, right? And everyone knows WordPress, whether you use it or not. Really good admin, easy admin interface. One-click install. You can go to most hosting companies and have one-click install. Mm-hmm. Super easy, and we can show you just kind of like where those things lie in Azure. Also, you can do kind of pre-configured stacks. So if you're a person who's like, yeah, I'm going to do Mongo and Express with Angular and Node, I'm going to put all that popular good stuff together, you can go and, again, kind of pre-configure that, and all this stuff's available, and just like basic Azure websites. Now, there are a few limitations when you're using Azure websites, and depending on what you need to do, you need to consider that. But the limitations are so, for the average project, not something that's going to really affect you. One of the things that I came across when I was working with Node is I wanted to configure something on a certain port. I was doing something called Space Brew, which is uses WebSockets based on Node, allows you to connect kind of different technologies together. And I was realizing, I need to configure a port, and I couldn't configure a port on website. So that was one thing that I couldn't do. Sometimes there's some modules for Node that are like native modules that need to be compiled. You can't do that. What's going to happen is when you deploy something using Azure websites and it's using Node, it's going to look at your package JSON, and it's going to basically npm install those things. So it doesn't have the ability to compile anything if anything needs to be compiled. So those are a couple of the limitations of Azure websites. In our case, they don't affect us at all. We don't have to worry about it, but just something to consider. If you need to configure ports or you need to compile kind of native modules for Node or something along those lines, you probably want to look at doing something like a VM or that kind of thing and setting up an instance that way. So if we look at Azure websites, there's a bunch of things that you can do. So you can configure a custom domain. Let's say you have a custom domain and you want to change the kind of default domain, and we'll show you that process. You can do that. You can FTP to it. Using Azure, you can run multiple websites. And the way that I tend to use it quite a bit is, again, for production and staging environments, where I'll actually have two websites kind of running. One will be my staging environment and a different URL for my production environment. And that way, they live on different URLs. They have different environments. They're getting deployed from two, different code sources. I usually use Git, to be honest. So I'll deploy from GitHub. And so I'll take a branch. For example, I'll have two branches. One might be master, one might deploy. So one will be staging, one will be, production. I tend to use a Git flow kind of way of working in that sense. So it's good for those kind of things. So I'm going to pop into the Azure portal. Once again, if you don't have access, you can sign up for a trial. It's good for 90 days. Once you get used to the interface and you walk in, you start to realize, wow, this is like, for me, this is, if I have to start setting up servers or deploying stuff, this is kind of how I want to work. So when I've got the portal already kind of. I'm logged in. I'm working in a different browser because I need to avoid the cookies. Otherwise, I can't log in as my own user. Long story short, we're looking at Azure, and what I've done is all these kind of items that are on the left. You'll see all these things that you can do, and there's so many options here depending on what you're doing. Now, only a couple of things here is really going to affect us, but to walk you through quickly, you've got websites, you've got, like I said, VMs, you've got virtual machines. So you could run Mongo in a VM if you wanted to. You could there's a bunch of different ways to set things up. Got mobile services, something we talked about in the past. You need to create a REST API really, really quick. You could definitely just tap into mobile services. Doesn't matter if it's iOS or Android or any of those things. Cloud, you got your databases, storage. You can just use it for storage. Just like upload your, treat it like you're going to upload all your pictures there, whatever you need to do. There's media services. There's Visual Studio Online, and that's something that we don't really have time to cover too much. But we have a new project called Monaco, where basically you could be just in the browser, pulling what you need and deploying right from there. So definitely look up Monaco and Visual Studio Online for that as well, because that's another way that a lot of people really love to work with Node.
It's got some special support for some of the things that we've been using, like Node, JavaScript, HTML5, CSS. It's fantastic.
Yeah, Python too, fantastic. I believe. Yeah. There's a bunch of things, and it's a really nice way to work. It's got a command kind of line that you start working in, and you can basically install what you need to install. It's a great way to work. But we're going to focus kind of on websites and just kind of show you just quickly how you can create your own website, and we're going to work on deploying a website as well, right? So in terms of websites. You can create new websites quite easily. And so I just hit the new button at the bottom. Now everything that you want to do in terms of creating, modifying, deleting, things that are relating to what you're looking at, it's usually just at the bottom. So this is the current portal. We have a new portal that's in preview. So, you could also take a look at the new portal, but I'm going to work with the current one. And, if you look over, you create a website, you can do quick create, you can do, custom if you need certain options, you can do gallery. Now, I'm not going to necessarily do from gallery here, but I just kind of wanted to show you what's available to you. So if you, are a person who has to set up servers, and I know previously I'm used to going in and basically configuring everything from scratch and, doing all that kind of work. A lot of this stuff is almost prepackaged from gallery. So depending on what you want to do, there's some common things. If you're a PHP person, Cake PHP is a really common framework. Once again, click install. It gives you what you need and configures it how you need. You can do, there's an HTML empty site, there's Ghost, a bunch of different things. Even towards the bottom, you've got, basic kind of things. There's WordPress if you want to do WordPress, right? You click it, you basically tell it what database to use, and then a bunch of those kind of things, and you're good to go. It's very, very quick. So, you can do it from gallery if you want. So for me, I'm just going to go and just to, kind of quick create a website. What you do is you specify a URL, and what's going to happen is that Azure is going to create this website for you, and it's going to give you this default URL. Now, let's go test Stacy. My first name, your last name, Rami. So, you've got, basically that's going to be the URL is whatever you put in here appended to the Azure websites.net. And then you got your web hosting plan, which is, free. If you have a free trial, for example, I'm running on here, you're doing all this for free. So you can just basically host it. And you can create website. Now, I don't need to configure a database or anything particularly right here. I'm just kind of setting up a website. And so I see that it's listed here and that it's running. I can see how it's running. I can see the URL. I can click it. And it's like, oh, this website has been successfully created. So it means that I need to put something there at some point. But once we go in, there's a couple things that you need to know just about this that's going to help us when we're working, especially with deploying from something like Visual Studio. Mm-hmm. And so looking at the dashboard here, if you click up top, your dashboard kind of gives you your overall view, right? And so some of these things will go more into depth once we've deployed our Node application. But just to kind of point out a couple of these things is that, your dashboard kind of gives you, like all dashboards, your quick overview to your site. And so you can see on the right things that you might need at some point in time. You want to FTP to your, let's say that's how you like to work. You want to FTP some stuff. You can set up deployment credentials, for example. You can view any kind of connection strings. You can deploy from source control, which is something we'll kind of just click through later in the session. And so you start to see, where these things are. Now, if I didn't want this to be my URL, which as intuitive and rolls off the tongue as it does, I might want to create, I might want to go buy a domain and change that. And you can easily, go and do that. And you just got to set a couple of things in a DNS record and you're kind of good to go. So, very quickly setting up a website, there's a whole bunch of other tabs that will go into detail about. Monitor is something that we'll probably take a look at once we've deployed something and explain a little bit about it a little more. But you start to see a good overview of what's happening with your site. You can see the versions that you're running. So this is really important, especially if you're working. How many times have I done this where I've deployed something that's PHP and it's the wrong version and I'm using some new feature? So you can, easily change those items that you might need. You can go through WebSockets, all the rest of it. And, once again, domain names. and figure out those things. Maybe you need verbose logging to see what's going on with your site. You can turn it on. So you can start to see, some of these things that are available to you, scaling, configuring, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff. But just setting up a simple basic website, we've kind of created something. We could push something up there a variety of different ways, however we want to do it. Yeah. So, going over basic, that's your basic website. And once again, you can work with just basic HTML. It can be Node. It can be Python. We don't care. We like them all. And being able to deploy them all, especially from Visual Studio, is one of those really lovely things. So I kind of did a basic view of the Azure dashboard. Should we go a little bit more into detail? Do you want to talk about any of those things in particular?
Yes, there's one thing that I definitely do want to talk about, and if you can take us back to the Configure tab.
Sure. 1 second.
All right.
You ask, I deliver.
Okay, Configure.
Yeah.
There is a WebSockets tab. Yeah, so ideally you want to actually turn that on.
Right.
Otherwise your WebSockets will just not work.
Right.
And there's an interesting thing about the WebSockets backend for Microsoft Azure. If you're curious, you could just read more about that on the different blog posts that I posted in the GitHub repo. If you look at the README, there's a link to a bunch of blog posts. The last one I'll go into more detail about specifically some of the things that happen in the behind the scenes to make WebSockets work.
Oh, nice.
For Node versus other languages.
Right.
But ideally, you need to turn it on.
Yep.
And you need to add something to your web.config file. It's all covered in the blog post, a little bit too much detail for this MVA, but it is there, and for the most part, it is already set up for you, so you don't need to worry about it. The minute that you turn it on, you're good to go.
And there's other, depending on what you're doing too. And configure is the high-level configuration stuff. So if you're doing WebSockets, you want to, maybe you're going to deploy this, and then you're going to decide you're going to edit it in Visual Studio Online. You can click it on, whatever you need to do. It's right there for you.
And the nice thing is that you get SSL support for free with Azure websites, because normally you have to pay extra for that, or it's a little bit complicated to set up. With Azure websites, you get it for free. You just need to put up your certificate. And this is actually really useful for WebSockets in the case where you need secure connections between your browser and the website.
Yeah.
And it also becomes very useful when you want to certify that your WebSocket connection is coming from something that you served as well.
Yeah.
So the minute that it's in a secure connection, it basically ensures that this WebSocket information is coming from something that I serve and not from some random other browser or something.
And actually thinking of that too, in terms of the certs that you need and whatnot. I remember I was using PHP, and I was installing. I was using SendGrid for email, because we don't have email support necessarily right out of the box. So for PHP, I was just using SendGrid API, which is it's so easy to configure.
Super straightforward.
But one of the problems was I go to run it, and I had to check the logs, and I realized, one of the libraries it was using, it was looking for a cert. There had to be a cert somewhere, and it wasn't there. So all I had to do basically was go in, create that cert, provide it, and I was done. I didn't have to worry too much about it.
Now, one last thing. So we've talked a lot about setting environment variables. Mm-hmm. Now, the Configure tag is actually where you do that. So if you scroll down the Configure tab, there's two places where you can set the connection strings to your MongoDB sites. The first one is using the connection strings at the bottom. Mm-hmm. So you can literally type for a name Mongo Lab URI, the one that we use in our code base, set the value of that.
So if you want to do Mongo Lab
_ URI, that was the one that we used. Mm-hmm. You can set the value for that, and then you can put custom in the drop-down. Now, what this is going to do. Azure is going to prepend a snippet of text at the beginning. That's the custom string text that you see in the code base, and we need to prepend that into the code base, because Azure will do that automatically. So
Right.
if you accidentally put the whole thing in the connection string, you won't be able to connect to your MongoDB.
Yeah, because you got to repeat what,
Yeah. I actually fell into that trap about a week ago.
I think everyone does, though. Because you're starting to, you're like, oh, why? Oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah, it's like, why can't I connect to Mongo? What's going on? The other thing, you can also use app settings, although it's not really recommended for connection strings.
Right.
And it's going to be a little bit different.
Yeah.
In that, if you try to put the fully qualified name that's in the code base under app settings, Azure will not let you do that.
Oh, nice.
It'll recognize this is a connection string and be like, no, you need to put it at the bottom thing. But you can still use it. You can still use like other naming conventions. Let's say you wanted to say, okay, I just want to say Mongo.
Sure.
That's my environment variable. You can put that in the app settings and you're good to go.
Yeah, so like if we were doing something that was along the lines of like, a Facebook secret, right? We could put in the value here and then we could access that or whatever. So that way you're not worrying about it in your code base. You're just going to access kind of those environment variables and it's, where it should be. Right?
Exactly. And the other cool thing is that you don't need to put this stuff in your source code. Yeah. Whoever has production access just needs to put it in the app settings and they're good to go.
Yeah.
It's not in the source code. It's safely away.
Yep.
It's hidden and it just works very well that way.
Yeah, and I don't know how you work personally, but I know locally I'll definitely probably store those in a configuration file. I might go set them up in environment variables depending on how I'm working. I might do a variety of things.
Yeah, that's one way to do it.
And then I'll clean then I'll clean them out before I actually commit it remotely. Yeah. Right? So I'll actually do a git ignore on that file, for example.
Exactly. I do something similar. I add it to the git ignore file. I'll have my custom config. I'll load it through a tool that I use to run Node.
Yeah.
And then it just works perfectly fine.
Yeah. So it's just something to consider when you're working with those things.
Awesome.
Awesome. Awesome. So we kind of went over a little bit about the dashboard. There's a ton of stuff. And once again, feel free to hit us up with any questions you might have about any of those things, and we'll answer them the best that we can. I mean, Azure is a big
platform.
It's huge. There's a lot that it can do. So we're showing you a little snippet. So we're going to talk about deploying to Azure with Visual Studio. And so one of the nice things that you've seen throughout the day is that we've been continually working in Visual Studio, editing our code, looking at all the different file types. We can create Node apps from scratch using any of the templates with the node.js, tool for Visual Studio, debugging it, all those kind of things. So when we're deploying, why step out of Visual Studio now? Why not just stay in Visual Studio? So we're going to talk a little bit about deploying to Azure with Visual Studio and how you do that and demo a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, so let's just switch over to my screen. And I just want to show you something that's really, really cool. So we've been using the command prompt. We've been using the command prompt to execute our Node app, but you can actually run your Node app straight from within Visual Studio. And the way you do that...
Show me how.
I will show you how. All you need to do is once you're in a project, you can set it as the startup project right here. And the minute you do that, you get
wait, can you go back and do that again? I was watching, but then I was like,
you right-click, find set as a startup project.
Perfect.
The minute you set that up and you're in this project, you'll notice right up here that you've got this interesting debug option where it basically says debug Internet Explorer. Now, it's not what it actually looks like, but...
What do you mean?
Well, here's the thing, because I don't know about you, but when I see this, I'm like, play Internet Explorer. That's what I see, right?
Yeah, I would assume it would launch that.
Yeah. So actually, what's going to happen is it's going to launch Node and IE.
Oh, gotcha.
And what's
so it's doing that whole work of opening the browser for you, so you don't have to
exactly. And what's really cool is you can also set other browsers as well. So in case you wanted to, I think locally on this machine we've only got Firefox installed. But let's say you also wanted to use the Windows Phone emulator. Yeah. So you can also launch to Windows Phone, which is pretty cool. So if I do it this way and I launch it with debug mode, I can actually go into my code and attach breakpoints, and the debugger will break whenever it reaches each of these points.
Oh, nice.
And this is all available to you when you install Node tools for Visual Studio.
Right.
It has all that support, including the syntax highlighting, including a whole bunch of other stuff, and it just sets you up correctly.
Awesome.
And that's what
that's what we've been saying, a lot of awesome stuff.
Awesome and stuff. Yeah. So we've got debugging covered. You've got most of the tools that come with Visual Studio for debugging set up. You can set different release cycles, release modes. Now, here's the thing about deploying to Azure with Visual Studio. You need to take a quick look at web.config. And the web.config is essentially the information that you need to deploy a Node project of any kind to Azure.
Right.
And what's really cool is that you can even set things like app settings in your Node, so you don't have to manually put it in the configure tab. And I wouldn't do this for sensitive information,
right,
because this web.config file is going to exist inside your source code repo. Yeah. I would put them on another way. Yeah. But for settings that are more